those companies who have invested in good practice and do good things, they're innovative, they're creative, they're the ones that really succeed financially, but also in other ways too, such as reputation and so on. And of course, we are the legal profession, so we have a duty over and above that of many of the sectors with regards to diversity, as the legal sector is responsible for the fair administration of justice, and we want to be a leader. We should be a leader, an example in this area. So next slide talks about some information and data. So the Solicitors Regulation Authority, we collect data every 2 years, the firm diversity data, I'm sure you'll be aware. And that information tells us that 3% of solicitors declare that they have a disability, and that figure hasn't changed virtually in the last 10 years. When you compare this to 13% of the workforce in the UK, and you look at the Equality Act definition, there's an estimated 19% of the working age population that is disabled. There's a massive underrepresentation of disabled people and a massive underreporting. And our engagement with firms, and the work we've been doing excuse me, with firms on disability and with individuals that work in firms, shows us that there is less being done around disability as there is for some of the other protected characteristics.
So our next slide, I just wanted to talk a little bit about the work that we have done. And we sent out a questionnaire to 3,000 law firms and to survey them about their policies and practices on disability inclusion. We received in total 421 completed responses to our questionnaire, and we found that there was no one single factor that firms needed to do to put in place to promote disability inclusivity, and that actually what is needed is to consider disability equality across all areas of a business to make sure that staff can thrive and be their best selves at work. We found some firms beginning to do more to promote disability. For example, signing up to initiatives promoting disability inclusivity, such as the valuable 500. We've engaged with disability experts, disabled solicitors and law firms, and asked them for their information, what they feel could be improved in law firms for disabled people. And finally, we did a review of existing research, because there isn't a lot of research out there on disabled and professionals in the legal profession. And it was important to see what was being said, how individuals were being supported, and what that research was saying. We know what we found was that there was some good practice, and firms did want to take positive steps in this area. And some of the things that we did find was, like, while disability inclusivity has been, unfortunately, largely absent from initiatives and programs in law firms, many firms have been making progress to recruit and to support and to promote disabled lawyers. Some law firms have set targets, and others have published their disability pay gap. And there were some firms which excelled in some areas, for example, having really positive support and good continuity support from senior leaders. We are working to identify and put in place and utilise examples of good practice. And we're trying to encourage firms to use these good practice examples, and we want to help and support and inspire change and promote new ways of doing things based on what is already working to enable real change to take place. We don't want to reinvent the wheel. We know that the things that disabled lawyers are saying can be put in place and have been put in place, and so this is what we're trying to support and to push those elements forward so that law firms can take that on board. The next slide.
Thank you. So our engagement with firms through the survey, and we've done workshops with individuals as well as firms, has really helped us to collate and identify what good practice exists in law firms and take on their experience and challenges that exist. And we've themed them into a few areas. And we'll talk about this as we go on, and Arsi will talk further too. But the themes are leadership and culture, Ultimately, leaders are responsible and accountable for ensuring that their firm is diverse and inclusive. They really do set the tone and culture of an organisation, and this is what individuals have told us, and firms, and we know this. I mean, it's not just true for diversity or disability inclusion. The other theme that we focused on is reasonable adjustments, and this was an area that brought about a lot of discussion. There was some misunderstanding about reasonable adjustments. There was some frustrations around reasonable adjustments. There was also some real good examples of what firms are doing on reasonable adjustments to support their disabled employees. And of course, reasonable adjustments are a legal requirement under the Equality Act. Another area was recruitment, retention and progression. So individuals talked about some of the barriers that they faced in regards to this, and firms talked about some of the challenges, but they also talked about some of the initiatives. And we know from our discussions and working in the area of diversity and inclusion that there's some real good initiatives out there and provisions that firms can implement. The other one was role models and networks. These are really important for career progression. Role models help, individuals told us, role models help define ability. And individuals spoke about, and actually so did firms, talk about the lack of role models in senior positions. So not being able to see people in those positions did have a massive impact. And networking and networks were really important too, and this came up quite a lot in these discussions. And finally, training and learning. It's important for everybody, and there's some really good training that's been delivered, but not everyone was getting the right training, or the training was reserved just for HR or senior partners or operational staff. But actually there was everyone in the organisation or everyone in the firm, individuals told us that actually needed the training or some level of training that was appropriate to the role that they had in the firm. And we also found that very few firms carried out disability training specifically. It was often buried and diluted with equality, diversity and inclusion training, so it didn't really go into the depth that perhaps was needed, and just was on the surface. So ultimately what we found was there are pockets of good practice, and firms did well in our findings on one or two areas. So there were some firms that were really good at implementing reasonable adjustments and were really flexible, but not so good at collecting data, or didn't think that data was important. We did have one firm tell us that they didn't understand why they needed to know who was working in their firm, and it didn't matter to them. So there was a lack of understanding on why we collect data and how data can really drive progress. So what we failed to find, or there was only a handful of examples, on firms providing or doing lots of things good in different areas, and all round good practice.
Yeah, some of the things that we found was that, for example, more confidence is needed around disability and making reasonable adjustments. And what I mean by that is that we found that law firms needed to be confident about putting in place processes so that it was simple and easy for people to request reasonable adjustments if they needed them. So in terms of the law firms making that initiative, it was really important that they took that initiative and made that first step in saying, you know, we are an organisation that we support making reasonable adjustments, and we want to talk to our colleagues, to our new recruits, about reasonable adjustments and whether they require them. If they do require them, we will support them to put that into place. So having discussions about a reasonable adjustment should be something managers have with their colleagues, and not only for the person needing, and it isn't only for the person needing them to initiate such discussions. It should be, as I mentioned, for the law firm, for managers to initiate those discussions as well. For sometimes, what we found was that for firms there was little understanding about the changing nature of adjustments, and that these can change with time, or that they may be dependent on what a person needs for a particular task, for example. Small things can make a big difference, such as somebody being seated in the middle of a group of people when a meeting is held so that they can hear better. And sometimes those small differences make a huge support for that individual that requires that adjustment. Disabled solicitors said that those who had positive experiences, had worked in firms where the conversation about workplace adjustments was opened early on, and that they could easily talk about the adjustment that needed. If these adjustments changed, they could explain what they might be, and they didn't feel that they had to keep quiet about the adjustments that they needed. We found that as part of that, it was really important to have visible leadership in place, and that is really key, where senior leaders promote disability inclusion. And when that happens, not only do the individuals thrive, but the firms do too. Monitoring and evaluation allows firms to measure progress, and that's monitoring across all areas of disability, in terms of disability diversity in the workplace, in terms of reasonable adjustments as well. There were a few firms, not very many, that looked at their data on disability, and Venetia mentioned this earlier. And I think it's important that law firms do this to identify actions they could take to encourage a diversity of applicants to apply in the initial stages, and also to track their disabled employees throughout their life cycle in the organisation. And if we don't have the data to show where our employees are sitting within an organisation, we're not able to make any changes that can support people to do their best and to help them to progress in the workplace. There is some emphasis on mental health and well-being that Venetia will speak to as well.
Thank you. So absolutely, I think there's a lot. We found that there is a lot of work that's being done on in the space of mental health and well-being. We know and hear of some really good practice in this area. Firms marking national days and weeks. We just had Mental Health Awareness Week, and I know lots of firms are doing amazing things. Firms inviting experts to talk about different aspects of mental health to raise awareness. And also we see there's a real drive and a push to address stigma and taboo in firms. And all this is great work, and we encourage that. I think it's really important that the similar efforts and emphasis put into disability and raising awareness. For example, it could be talking about social model of disability and what that means, or looking at the experience and barriers that disabled people face, or even just reasonable adjustments. There is as I said when we started earlier, that there is there's a lack of confidence around reasonable adjustments, and this is something that firms could look to do. I also mentioned, I mention it again, that very few firms provided disability-related training, so specific training, and where they did provide it, was usually the impetus was the clients were disabled, or it was mental health problems or mental health experiences of individuals, and they would provide that training. So it wasn't really centered around employees. It was more embedded into, as I said, equality, diversity and inclusion training. So perhaps just a little section on disability, equality and being inclusive. And also we found that training tended to focus on preventing discrimination as opposed to being proactive, and looking at ways to be proactive and raising awareness. So this is something that firms to think about.
So we think initiatives around mental health and well-being in law firms is really key to helping employees do well. But we do want to say that as part of those initiatives, if firms should be committed to putting in place initiatives around disability equality as well. So all of those three things should come together. It should not simply just be around mental health or simply be around well-being. It should be around disability, mental health and well-being. As Venetia mentioned, there are a few firms that provide training on workplace adjustments, workplace reasonable adjustments, and this is an area where disabled staff felt firms could do more. They felt that the training that could be provided should be provided by experts. It should be provided by disabled people themselves. And it shouldn't be ad hoc and just provided to a few people in the business. It should be rolled out across the business, from people who are associates to senior leaders to people working in the HR team, for example. Firms can record and monitor workplace adjustment requests, and I think it's really important that they do that. They can monitor those adjustments and those requests for clients as well, and that will help them understand what kind of requests are coming into the organisation, and if there's something, a wider piece of work that they can do around that to support that. So, for example, if there are more people that have been identified that they need support around dyslexia, what can the firm do to provide a more holistic approach to those employees that require that support? Monitoring and evaluation, as I mentioned, of workforce diversity data allows the firm to track that progress and to develop evidence-based policies and initiatives, and it helps to identify if an organisation has been successful in achieving its aims. And also how it also supports how we can appropriately identify what more can be done to promote those inclusive practices. So drafting a policy and setting out actions on disability inclusion that helps improve employees' experience and their well-being as well. As I mentioned earlier, leadership and culture, senior leaders, this is a key to making progress. And promoting values and behaviours that specifically address and mention disability is really important. Senior leaders should demonstrate that support by attending training and events, and also to initiate conversations on reasonable adjustments and workplace adjustments as well. Because it's not only leading by example, but advocating and promoting values and behaviours that support disability inclusivity. And if you can show that you are doing that, other people can see that as a role model in you as well. So by including disability actions and targets in organisational plans and strategies, managers can be trained on disability inclusion, and also in terms of supporting and sponsoring disability staff networks, and to make sure that any actions that come out of staff networks feed into management meetings. I think that's quite important to build those networks into a firm and to make sure that where support is needed around disability inclusivity, it is there and it's available.
So just touching on that management meeting point, I think we often find that firms, or in the past have said, EDI or disability inclusion or gender inclusion is an agenda item, a standing agenda item in our meetings, but actually there's little or no substance sometimes. So for example, it comes to the agenda item and people are asked, do they have anything to say on that topic? And people don't feel comfortable or confident enough to bring up any matters that they want to talk about. So if you've really talked about or set your targets, you've included it in your strategies, you've got a focus, this will really help you with your management meetings, and you'll have a discussion, a meaningful discussion around what you can do to promote disability inclusion. Some of the firms that we talked about, some of the firms that we talked to also included specific questions on disability in their staff surveys, and this is something that's a really good, a good suggestion and something that we can do to promote disability inclusion. It gives you an idea of how people are feeling and how well you're doing on disability inclusion.
So I think what we want to kind of conclude with is that to support individuals and to support staff, it's really important to provide that support and help from a senior level. So for example, in terms of staff networks, sometimes the onus is on an individual or on a few individuals to promote that staff network, to take that staff network forward, to identify the actions and the issues that they want, that staff network, that disability staff network want to promote. But in terms of the law firm as a whole, if senior leaders can support that drive, can open up the conversation, in terms of events or in terms of training, to do small things like post blogs on the intranet, to post on Twitter, to post on social media, to show that their law firm is taking disability equality seriously. I think that's a really an important step in the right direction. We want to move away from the tick box. We want to move away from saying, yes, we are a disability inclusive firm because we have disabled people working here, but it's not about the disabled people working there. It's making sure that those people that are in that firm are treated in a way that they can do the best work that they can do. If they need, for example, adjustments such as flexible working, if they need to work at different times, if they need to work more at home like we're all doing now, then that can be facilitated, and that support provided to those individual people. We would like to hear more from you all, and if you would like to support this work, we are continuing in terms of trying to raise awareness and to identify good practice. We'd really like it if you got in touch with us. You can see the videos that we've produced already, and the case studies, and our report already published on our website at sra.org.uk/disability. Please have a look, and if there's any way that you feel that the SRA, we could be doing more to promote disability inclusivity in the profession as a whole, and please get in touch.
So thank you for taking part in our live today, and I hope it's been informative. Thank you.
Thanks very much. Thank you for joining us.